So, our afternoon speaker, first one after lunch, that's sometimes not a good thing, right? Is Frances Kolb Turnbell. She is a historian of colonial America with a specialty in 18th century Mississippi Valley. She received her PhD from Vanderbilt and teaches at the University of North Alabama. She's the editor of the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. Her book, Contesting Borderlands, Policy and Practice in Spanish Louisiana, 1763 to 1803, is under contract with LSU Press. So let's please welcome Dr. Turnbull.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to pick up with Indian politics and the American Revolution, and we're going to be thinking about the lower Mississippi Valley in particular. What we really see after the 7 Years' War is that the lower Mississippi Valley is a region where there's a lot of contest over alliances, and we're going to see that continue into the American Revolution and affect the way Indians participate in the conflict. So Indian participation in regional conflict is going to be significant to wartime conflict as well. And as we think about these things, we're going to focus on three particular episodes during the war, just to sort of highlight the competition of alliances that are going on and the different choices that the various Indian groups in the lower Mississippi Valley are considering. So first we'll think about the Indians of lower Louisiana and how they joined Galvez in his Mississippi River campaign. Then we'll take a look at this really sort of big looming question about sustaining the loyalty of Indians of the Southeast to Britain at Pensacola. And then finally we'll look at a less familiar moment, the Natchez Rebellion of 1781, and we'll see competing alliances operating there again. And I know a lot of our conversations dovetail really well this morning and as we're moving into the afternoon, but in case anyone needs a refresher on the timeline of things, we're going to rewind a little bit and start earlier in the 1770s to make sense of what goes on in the war. But we'll talk a little bit about the Wheeling Raid of 1778 and then move on into the years of actual conflict themselves. So the Mississippi campaign and then Mobile, Pensacola. You want to see on here that Pensacola and the Natchez Rebellion, there's a point where they're overlapping in time. These things are happening at the same moment. Okay, so for the first episode that I want to consider with you this afternoon, I want to look at these Indian groups that are living in lower Louisiana by the time the American Revolution begins there, for our purposes, 1779. The years of partition, 1763 to 1779, were years of great transition for West Florida, Spanish Louisiana. And that's certainly the case for these Indian groups that are living there. And so as soon as the 7 Years' War ends, what happens is that all of these small groups that had lived near Biloxi, Mobile, and on the Gulf Coast immediately begin to migrate west towards Spanish Louisiana because they've got a history of alliance with France and the Choctaws against the Chickasaws and the British. And they've been victims of the slaving raids of the Chickasaws as well. So they are hesitant to remain in British territory. So they migrate westward, but they very quickly realize that with the new international boundary now running down the Mississippi River and around the Isle of Orleans, that this is a contested zone that is putting them in a position of political power, because both Britain and Spain desperately want them as allies. And so these years of partition are characterized on the one hand by agents of Britain and Spain on the ground trying to woo these various groups, and there are quite a number of them. And then on the other, by these groups, and I've listed a few at the bottom of this slide, really kind of flexing their political muscles, using the opportunity to cross the international border to make, from their perspective, alliances with Spanish officials and with British officials. Now, the Spanish officials and British officials are constantly demanding exclusive alliance with, the Tunicas or the Alabama or the Picañas or whoever they're trying to deal with. But these groups continue to emphasize to those imperial officials on both sides of the divide that it's their right to make friends with as many groups as they want. So to their political and material benefit, they show up at the Spanish fort of Manchac and the British fort of Manchac. They receive gifts. The officials participate in ceremonies. And so in this moment, they very, very effectively play those empires off of each other and benefit from that. And as they do so, they continue to use their mobility to their advantage. So for a moment, they'll settle on the Spanish side. Then they'll hop and settle on the British side, and they think they've got a permanent ally, and they don't. What is going to change this is Willing's Raid. Willing's Raid is an episode that takes place in 1778. And this represents a very important turning point for the lower Mississippi Valley during the American Revolution. Obviously, conflict has already broken out, right, to the east, and by this point, Spain is assisting the United States. But this is the first time we really see conflict in the lower Mississippi itself, and this sort of connects with Larry Nelson's talk this morning in the sense that he explored George Rogers Clark and the question of what the Continental Congress sees and wants out of these things. James Willing had lived in British West Florida for a few years. He was the younger brother of an important merchant family in Philadelphia, and he made a lot of enemies, but he also worked with Oliver Pollock, had some land grants, developed some property there with Pollock. And so even though George Morgan, who many of you may be familiar with from New Madrid, George Morgan really had wanted the job of conducting this raid on British West Florida and this expedition down the Mississippi. But because of politics, because of who Willing's family was and their connections with Robert Morris, he gets this role. So in February 1778, Willing and his band of patriots and opportunists strike at Natchez, and then continue to do so all the way down the coast of British West Florida on the Mississippi River, looting, seizing property, burning things. They confiscate slaves. They bring many of these things to Spanish Louisiana, but generally they create this episode of tremendous and unexpected chaos. And in this moment, the British colonists living in West Florida on the Mississippi River do not turn to Britain. They don't look to Pensacola. They hop the river and go to Spanish posts and settlements and the people that they trade with nearby. And then they turn their attention to New Orleans for their redress of grievances. So again, they're not looking to Pensacola. They're looking to Bernardo de Galvez. They've lost property. They sort of seek his attention just as much as James Willing does. And so for our purposes, the important thing about Willing's Raid is that it leaves those living on the Mississippi River convinced that Spain is the stronger empire in the region before the war really breaks out on the Gulf Coast. And so this is really the sort of the key moment, I would argue, to cementing some of those alliances with those small native groups to the Spanish Empire versus the British. And so once we hit that Mississippi campaign, by and large, lower Louisiana Indians will participate with Spain in that conflict. So, for example, the Humas, I'm not good at this. Let's see. The pointer, how do I do that? Do you? Okay, that's fine. So they're gonna live these groups are just sort of to the west of New Orleans over here, and then further near the boundary with Texas is where you're gonna draw allies into Galvez's campaign. And what's interesting, these Alabama and Picañas who are going to join Galvez as he moves from New Orleans to Manchac and Baton Rouge, they're going to be operating for him with other non-Indians as well, with free black and enslaved scouts as well. But they're going to be acting as scouts for Galvez. And they had lived just recently and traded and operated near that fort at Manchac, near those two forts at Manchac and at Baton Rouge. So they know this land and they know the people really, really well. So they really are an asset to him in the conflict. And the Mississippi River Campaign also, for Galvez, is an opportunity to test Louisiana and the militia, the Indian allies. Spain's been working for 10 years, really, at this point, to develop loyalty in these groups. And there's been some uncertainty as to what they could handle and couldn't handle in a conflict. And so the Mississippi River Campaign really assures him of the support, loyalty, et cetera, of these groups. So we'll return to them in just a little bit. And I'm going to gloss over Mobile briefly, because what I'd like us to think about as Spain, has now secured the Mississippi River, the lower part at least, is that Galvez and planning is going to turn eastward. And as they do so, it's a different set of Indian groups that are going to come into play. These are the Indians of the Southeast: Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokees. And so the success of taking Mobile is really the moment that opens up the question of loyalty of these groups even more. So in preparation for Mobile, Spain was acutely aware of the strategic significance of that place, and Galvez knew that in taking Mobile, it would not only increase the pressure on Pensacola, but it would strengthen Spain's project of gaining allies from these primary groups: Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and to a lesser degree, Cherokees. He knew that Indian allies could only assist him as he looked and planned for Pensacola. Spain's awareness of its need for Indian allies and the necessity of meeting Indians of the Southeast according to their own terms, according to their own diplomatic customs, contrasts sharply what the British are about to do. And so at the conquest of Mobile, Galvez recognizes that one of Britain's strengths is successful alliances with these southeastern Indians, and he's going to try and chip away at them. And so he even proposes to Campbell as early as April in 1780 that neither side engage Indian allies in the next conflict. Now, that obviously didn't go over. But, that sort of gives you a sense of the importance Galvez saw in these Indian allies. So Spain had not given up on this prospect of chipping away at the not-so-long-lived British-Choctaw alliance. Remember, the Choctaws have been the enemies of the British until 1763. And they had been hesitant initially about creating alliances with them. And Britain's policy changes in the middle of the war expanded Spain's opportunity. Galvez was adamant that all Indians who visited Mobile or New Orleans received their supplies and gifts. So things like ammunition, tobacco, and alcohol were all among the gifts and provisions that the Choctaw 6 town chiefs, those in closest proximity to Mobile, expected when they cooperated with Spain and surrendered their British medals for Spanish ones after the Spanish victory. Under Spain, Mobile continued as a site where empire welcomed Indians who arrived to engage in diplomacy. Mobile had been a site for imperial and Indian diplomacy since the French periods. This is a well-established practice. And so at the end of April 1780, you see groups of creeks, lower creeks, and smaller groups of upper creeks linked with American rebels in Georgia also reach Mobile. And they're going to request gifts and ammunition as well. Unfortunately for Spain, the supplies at Mobile run low, and they have to redirect these allies to New Orleans. Wartime makes access to these very important trade goods difficult. And so the project of supplying Indian wants, needs, diplomacy is a real challenge during the war, and it's going to remain a challenge after the war as well. Now that Spain has secured this strategic location and everyone's kind of thinking and looking towards Pensacola, again, that question that's looming is the loyalty of these groups that some in the short term, some in the long term have been connected with Britain. 1780 is nearly a year after the death of John Stuart, and I believe you heard about him a little bit in the last talk. And a lot had changed by this point. So as we're moving into late 1780 into 1781, Stuart's death was a watershed moment for Indian relations in the Southeast. He had embodied the British Indian Department in the Southeast as it had existed since the 7 Years' War, well-funded, powerful, and centralized. When he was forced to flee to Charleston earlier in the war, the hubs for British Indian relations also shifted from Charleston and Augusta to St. Augustine and Pensacola. Now, a result of new policies, efforts to curtail what Britain saw as wasteful spending of the Indian Department, no longer centralized, the department south of the Ohio was broken into smaller territories. And we're going to think about one particular official in that now decentralized Southern territory, Alexander Cameron. He becomes the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Mississippi. And in the new arrangement, a shocking departure for him and for Indian allies alike, Cameron and those like him were meant to travel through Indian towns and villages, conducting diplomacy there rather than at congresses and meetings in the colonial centers of Mobile, Pensacola, etc. As much as Britain wanted the friendship of the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokees, it was beginning to pull back on meeting them in traditional ways and according to their wants. Let's see. So Cameron eventually finds himself the only leading official in Pensacola who recognized the necessity of regular gift giving to the health of Indian relations, and who recognized the health of Indian relations to the success of the British in West Florida. Both Campbell and Chester are very stingy with the gift giving. Chester refuses to disperse the funds that he's been allotted for entertaining Indians at Pensacola, for example. Now, the war poses an interesting moment for Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokees. We want to think about these groups not as sort of nations with one leader. These are confederations, and each is made up of an array of towns and villages, some with connections to one another. So they have sort of a common identity as Choctaws, for example, but they're not all going to do the same thing necessarily. Each town and village is going to make its own decision in the war as to who it's going to support. And trade, consequently, really matters in this moment. We're going to see the Choctaws continue to go to Mobile. Spain's going to chip away a little bit at some of Britain's strengths. But for Choctaws and culturally similar groups, the American Revolution is going to offer both opportunity and apprehension. Warriors have a moment to prove themselves in the eyes of Choctaw society and to acquire prestige. War allows Choctaw spiritual leaders an opportunity to assert their power of offering spiritual protection in war. Additionally, war is going to bring opportunity for Indian leaders to gain access to trade goods, which is going to bolster their power within their society as well. So as we move towards Pensacola, the big thing that's going to differentiate the Spanish from the British is that we're going to see the British really pull back on those customary practices that have buttressed their alliances, even with the Chickasaws, their oldest and most important, most powerful ally in the greater Southeast. So as Spain makes inroads, nevertheless, Campbell still has a really good alliance working for him. In early 1780, he's got 1,200 or so Creeks, several hundred Choctaws, and a handful of Chickasaws who show up to assist him at Pensacola, March 1780. The great metal chief Payamataha, who's a Chickasaw leader, is going to continue to urge the Chickasaws and some Choctaws into supporting Britain. But in the months between the confrontation at Mobile and Pensacola, Campbell forged a reputation as demanding of his allies, stingy with his resources, and deaf to their ways of waging war. Time and again, he's going to call upon them when danger is near. He's sort of like the little boy who cries wolf, only to dismiss them without supplies, ammo, or gifts. Seemingly without hesitation, Creeks and Choctaws materialized for Pensacola's defense, only to be dismissed when the threat of Spanish attack dissipates. By the fall of 1780, when Choctaw allies were busy patrolling the southeast and causing trouble for the Spanish around Mobile, they stood ready to come to Pensacola. But Campbell refused Choctaw requests for gunpowder in spite of having a good supply on hand and in spite of relying on them for military assistance. Choctaw leaders then learned that Britain would not hold the council that they had requested, nor would they receive gifts that November. The denial of a traditional Congress stung, especially when Cherokees and Creeks to the east had recently gathered at Augusta. Meanwhile, Campbell arrogantly supposed Choctaw war parties would continue to patrol on his behalf. On November 6th, a party of Choctaw warriors entered Pensacola brandishing 6 Spanish scalps. Now, they were thrilled about these scalps, and they expected to be rewarded and commended. This was a result of a conflict at Mobile Village, which is across Mobile Bay from Fort Charlotte. However, instead of being applauded, Campbell and others at Fort Charlotte were disgusted. Not surprisingly, they were disgusted by the scalps, but what this does is this reinforces for the Choctaws this sense that their service is not appropriately appreciated. And it also highlights some of the deafness of Campbell to the necessity of meeting these native allies sort of on their terms. Still, Campbell's going to call upon the Choctaws that very next month to remain on hand at Pensacola as rumors of invasion persist. In January 1781, approximately 800 Choctaws, Creeks, and Chickasaws reached Pensacola again for Britain's defense. The Choctaws in this group are coming from at least 20 different towns and villages. This striking response to Campbell's appeal still failed to budge him from his stern policies towards gifts and supplies. And so these Indians begin to go home as the threat seems to have dissipated. And then in one final episode, March 7th, 1781, as we're on the cusp of the siege of Pensacola, a Choctaw chief of West Yazoo, Frenchy Mistabe, is on his way home with his warriors when Cameron and another trader overtake his party. These Choctaws had left Pensacola the day before, March 6th, when they were after being called yet again to Campbell's assistance. Once more, Frenchy Mistabe received this plea to come to Pensacola. So at this point, this is 3rd, 4th, 5th, depending on the group he's with, time that they're being called to Pensacola. This time, however, his response was different. So we're here on the eve of war. The response is different from what it had been at all of the previous moments. So Frenchy Mistabe says, yes, I will come. But instead of telling his warriors to follow him, he turns around and tells them, each of you make up your own mind. You have no obligation to come with me to Pensacola. And so this is a dramatic departure from anything that has preceded it in this alliance during the war. So the Indian allies who materialized in March were far fewer than had previously responded to any of Campbell's calls for aid. In spite of the important role he would assign them in the defense of Pensacola and the Empire, Campbell released no gunpowder to the Choctaws, who turned out for the actual siege. Yet, with 100 British troops, these Choctaw warriors met the Spanish as they entered the harbor. Alexander McGillivray, 80 Creeks, reached Pensacola in early April. Additional parties of Choctaws and Chickasaws, including some linked with James Colbert, will also reach Pensacola. Although the American Revolution was not a native conflict per se, in many spaces throughout North America, Indians recognized it as a war worth waging, worth engaging. But by the time the siege of Pensacola occurs, participation of southeastern Indians was lacking compared with what it might have been. This, Britain's last stand on the Gulf Coast, was not a native conflict by that time. And for that, Britain and her officials really only had themselves to blame. And Galvez even commends in his writings the Indian allies of Britain for their bravery and the trouble they caused him, basically, while he's at Pensacola. But they were less than, I think they were half possibly, or a fraction of some sort of what they could have been if Campbell had been able to sustain those alliances. We have the great victory of Galvez at Pensacola, which is a very exciting moment. But as all of this is going on, as he's kind of finishing up there and then is glorying in the great prize of Pensacola, trouble is brewing elsewhere. The war in the lower Mississippi isn't actually over. Oh, here's mine. I missed a slide. The last point on this is that there is an ongoing legacy in many of these southeastern Indian towns of loyalty to Britain. And so we're going to see persistent connection with former loyalists in many of these places. So the Natchez Rebellion, I'm going to touch on the events here a little bit more than some of the other ones I've talked about, just because they're less familiar, I think, to people. So we're going to pick up April 21st, 1781. The post commandant at Natchez, Spain gets Natchez after the capitulation at Baton Rouge. So the Spanish official there, who's of course French, Jean de la Villeboeuf, describes his post as a place of tranquillité on April 21st. But by April 22nd, he has found himself and his men under siege in the Spanish fort, which is represented here. And this is what's going to begin the Natchez Rebellion of 1781. Some 200 or so rebels, many armed, with about 20 Choctaw allies gathered before the fort. They flew the British flag, a symbol of their legitimacy. The Loyalists and their leaders had been emboldened and even possibly believed in their legitimacy, the legitimacy of their cause, because previously, as Campbell had awaited Galvez's attack, an opportunity to instigate trouble at Natchez had presented itself, and he took advantage of it. Several colonists were in communication with him, possibly sending a petition of real and forged signatures of Natchez residents, and Campbell assured the rebel leaders that their actions would be sanctioned wartime military activity, as he granted them captain's commissions and sent them gunpowder. The rebellion jolted de la Villeboeuf, as we could tell, but likely after it began, his knowledge of local rumors and the previous month's happenings at Natchez began to echo in his mind. There was little question that James Colbert had pressured Natchez colonists to throw off the Spanish. Mingo Humas, who de la Villeboeuf recognized as one of the most powerful chiefs of the Choctaws, described how 18 warriors had met and learned of conspiracy at the Yazoo River among Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Britons who plotted to descend upon Natchez. And there are millions of these rumors running around in the war of Britons, Loyalists, and their Indian allies, and how they're going to sweep the Spanish out of the Mississippi valley, really. They're going to come down, they're going to retake Natchez, they're going to descend upon the Red River. There's all of these rumors sort of constantly brewing, and everyone is sort of very tense with their awareness of these things. And then there's another important facet towards this Indian context that we find Natchez in. Natchez, yes, it's a settler location, and it certainly is populated during the British period. But there was an ongoing connection of Natchez inhabitants with many native groups, which lent these reports of conspiracy some veracity. Numerous colonists, single men, and families had migrated to British West Florida through Indian country, living with Indian groups and in Indian towns and villages at times on their way. Some even listed Cherokee towns as their places of origin when they settled in West Florida. Trade routes to the Choctaws especially also passed through Natchez. So this is very much a native space as well. Ultimately, again, for our purposes of Indian alliances, we could go on longer about the Natchez Rebellion, but ultimately the rebels, they play a trick on the Spanish commandant. They convinced de la Vibovre that they are going to blow up his fort. They've captured the bateau of Francois Vallée, and de la Vibovre believes they're going to use the gunpowder from that to destroy or to blow up part of his fort. So he surrenders after this trick, and the Natchez rebels take the fort for a time. So May 3rd to the end of June, basically, we see the Natchez Rebellion continue. Now, when this happens, Spain, as we know, is kind of bogged down in other places, with its energy spent in other places as well. And so the response to the Natchez Rebellion, after we've laid some of this groundwork, is going to come out of lower Louisiana, and it's going to come out of a coalition among the militias of the various outposts. And you see a lot of these listed here on this map: Natchitoches, Rapide, Point Coupee, Opelousas, Attakapaw, St. James as well. The militia in these places and their Indian allies are going to come together to respond. And so while they are sanctioned and supported by the leaders in New Orleans, at this point it's Pedro Piernas, the lieutenant governor, who's sort of taking care of things while Galvez is gone, well, he supports them. It's really the operation is really carried out by the militia and their native allies. From New Orleans, Piernas is going to entrust supplies of ammunition to the Humas, who live between New Orleans and Point Coupee, basically. And they were returning home to gather more warriors and then join the war party at Point Coupee. Champagne, who's a chief of the Chitimacha Indians, also from that general area, sort of just west of New Orleans. Unlike most of the militia and Indian groups of the area, he had not participated. The Chitimachas didn't actually participate in the Mississippi campaign, as far as we know. They were dealing with a conflict with the Quapaws at the time. But he tells Piernas that he too wanted to be part of the expedition, and soon he and his warriors also are on their way. The alarming situation of the rebels gaining Natchez, and then again, these rumors that are coming to all of these posts and are spreading among all of these people, native, settler, slave, etc., they've generated tremendous distress. And so this moment of sort of endangerment of Louisiana itself really sees the overlap of local interests and imperial interests. And so as news of Spanish victory at Pensacola unnerves the rebels at Natchez, it's going to bolster the morale of the militia and the Petite Nation, the little Indian groups who are gathering together already to respond at Natchez. By early June, plans to reconquer Natchez had coalesced, with the captain of the Attakapaw and Opelousas militia, Robert de la Morandière, taking the lead. And he's going to lead his combined force of these militia and of groups including Humas, Chitimachas, Choctaws. There's some Choctaws at this point who've settled along the Red River near Rapide, of Choctaws, Pascagoulas, Appalachies, Alabama, lots of these smaller nations. And they're going to go to Natchez, and they are, in fact, successful in retaking that fort on June 23rd. So we see sort of the contest of some competing local alliances and some of the power of rumor as well in this episode. The aftermath of the rebellion at Natchez and on the Mississippi highlights both the uncertainty of the post-war as well as the enduring relationships among British settlers, the Loyalist cause, and some native towns, villages, and bands. Rebels, so we're talking about Loyalist rebels here, not American Revolutionary rebels. Rebels quickly took flight from the reach of Spain. And again, it's interesting, where do they turn? They're turning to Indian towns and villages. Most of them go to the Chickasaws in patterns of short and long-term migration. Many travel east, some settle with Choctaws, Cherokees. And what's interesting, and I think hard for us today to think about, is that life often among the Indians at points of early American history, and this is one of them, life among the Indians actually appeared more stable for some of these families and individuals from Natchez, from this sort of outpost on the Mississippi River. The Chickasaws and James Colbert, in particular, receive a good number of the rebels into their fold. Some speculations, upwards of 80, with upwards of 40 remaining there still in 1782. One of the most significant legacies of the rebellion was the common cause it generated among Loyalists. The release of the rebel leaders imprisoned by Spain becomes their cause. And they sort of hold on to this until the release of those prisoners in 1783. So between the end of the rebellion in June 1781 and the release of those, some of those prisoners in 1783, we're going to see various types of banditry and protest. The most famous, of course, is James Colbert and his band of followers, Indian settler, some enslaved as well, and their acts of piracy on the Mississippi River. Perhaps most famously, 1782 at Chickasaw Bluffs, they seized the vessel that is bringing Ana Corona Ramos and her children, the family of Francisco Cruzat, to the Illinois country. So they cause a great deal of distress. They also attack the fort at Arkansas. They fail this project. But anyway, Colbert and his men are persisting in being a thorn in the side of the Spanish on the Mississippi River after the Natchez Rebellion. Ultimately, Moreau, the next governor of Louisiana, is going to try to neutralize Colbert's efforts by leaning on the Chickasaws through their allies. He's going to try and get to them to get Colbert to chill out and stop causing so much trouble. But ultimately, Spain releases the prisoners, and Colbert dies at the end of the war, too. So those two things really kind of cause the mischief of these groups to dissipate. So the war tested sort of Indian decision-making, decisions about which empire to favor, which alliances to participate in, which refugees to harbor. The post-war, the decades following the American Revolution, are going to introduce a new moment. Native groups of the lower Mississippi and greater Southeast, who had weighed decisions about participation in wartime conflict, are now going to find a new era of competition and diplomacy. And the border is going to move, which is going to be important for this new scenario. For the Indians of lower Louisiana, we're going to see this as sort of sadly an era of increased marginalization. They've proved themselves in war, the Mississippi Campaign, alongside the militia, putting down the Natchez Rebellion, two very important things. They're commended, they're promised rewards and gifts, etc. Unfortunately, many of those groups are still asking the Spanish to follow through with those rewards as we move through the 1780s. Many populations of these groups also diminish. There's yellow fever, etc., that's moving through here at this time, and that affects these groups badly because their populations are already small. And they continue to use mobility to try to redefine sort of where they are, who they associate with within society, and how they fit into that society. Many will continue to push west or move into the Red River Valley. And also after the war, we see those leaders in New Orleans less likely to favor those smaller Indian groups in disputes with settlers and traders and things like that than they had before the war. The new border is going to be contested in the southeast between the United States and Spain. Spain is going to argue that its territory encompasses the land south of the Tennessee River. The United States is going to say the 31st parallel. And so until basically the end of the 18th century, the treaty that decides this is in 1795, but it's not actually put into place until a little bit later. Until 1795, 1798, until the end of this century, this zone is incredibly contested, and you're going to see Americans and the Spanish using trade and treaties to try to secure those allies we were talking about during the war, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Cherokees. And their various, again, bands, their confederacies. And so no one, shockingly, because there's not one person making these, diplomatic decisions for each group, no one is really able to gain all of the Choctaws or all of the Chickasaws. But what is interesting is that this becomes sort of a competition and project to supply these Indians in this moment when their political power is heightened after the American Revolution. And for the Spanish, that happens through loyalist traders. So they've defeated Britain, but after the war, and even actually while it's ongoing, they're working with British citizens and the post-war loyalists to access the trade goods that they need to try to hold on to Indian allies and expand their influence in the Southeast. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And ultimately, in this competition, trade is going to be key before those sort of treaties settle the question. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes before we do the next session with Steve, so if we have questions.
As I remember it, General Campbell was a direct report to Lord George Germain, right? And I think we're going to hear a lot more about this in the next talk. But wasn't he really starved of resources, both manpower and material, by Germain?
Yes, Germain is not interested in spending a lot of money on native allies either. No, that's definitely, Campbell's not the only one operating this way, for sure.
Anybody else? Wow, looks like you thoroughly covered that topic, that there are no more questions.
Thank you, Joan.
So we're going to switch out so Steve Kling can come up and get ready to do his talk.